Damon Lancaster stepped out of his sleek black Aston Martin, buttoning the cuffs of his tailored Armani suit as he gazed up at the sprawling Hawthorne estate. This was the house of his enemy, the man who had destroyed his father's legacy, humiliated his family, and left him with nothing but the burning desire for revenge. And tonight, he was taking the first step in his plan. By the end of the month, he would be engaged to his rival's daughter. The grand ballroom was filled with the city's elite, sipping champagne and murmuring about stock prices and mergers. Damon moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, his sharp blue eyes scanning for her. He had seen pictures, of course. Charlotte Hawthorne, heiress to the Hawthorne Empire, a woman raised in luxury, blissfully unaware of the war between their fathers. And then he saw her. She stood near the balcony, her emerald green dress hugging her curves, her dark brown hair cascading down her back. But it wasn't her beauty that made him pause, it was the way she carried herself. Unlike the other women in the room, simpering and eager for attention, Charlotte seemed detached, almost bored, perfect. Damon approached, his voice smooth. "You look like you could use a better conversation." She turned, her green eyes meeting his with a flash of curiosity. "And you think you can provide that? I guarantee it." He extended his hand. "Damon Lancaster." She hesitated, just for a second, then she placed her hand in his. "Charlotte Hawthorne." Their fingers touched, and something unexpected flickered in his chest. He ignored it. This wasn't about attraction, it was about revenge. Charlotte studied him with a raised brow. "I know who you are, my father hates you." Damon smirked. "That makes me wonder why you're still talking to me." She tilted her head. "Maybe I like making my father angry. Interesting." Damon leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Then let's really make him furious." Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment he thought she might slap him, but then a slow, mischievous smile spread across her face. "I'm listening." Damon played the game well. He was charming, attentive, and exactly the kind of man who could sweep a woman off her feet. He took Charlotte to the most exclusive restaurants, sent bouquets of rare roses to her office, and made sure the gossip columns whispered about their budding romance. And she responded in ways he hadn't expected. She wasn't just beautiful, she was intelligent, witty, and full of contradictions. Raised in wealth but unimpressed by it. Dutiful to her father yet defiant in her own quiet way. The more time Damon spent with her, the more complicated she became, but it didn't matter. He wasn't here to fall in love. He was here to ruin her father. One night, as they sat in a private booth at a high-end restaurant, Charlotte placed her wine glass down and studied him. "Tell me something real." Damon raised a brow. "Real?" "Yes." She leaned forward, her green eyes searching his. "We've been playing this game, but I don't know anything about you." He smirked. "You know plenty. I'm devastatingly handsome, infuriatingly charming, ridiculously wealthy. That's not what I mean." She shook her head. "Tell me something no one else knows." Damon hesitated. This was dangerous territory. He had spent years crafting the perfect image, untouchable, unshakable. But something about the way she looked at him made him want to give her something real. "My father built Lancaster Industries from nothing," he admitted. "He was brilliant, ruthless, but fair. Your father destroyed him." Charlotte stiffened. He crushed his businesses one by one, took everything from us, and left my father a broken man." Damon's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "And now I'm returning the favor." Silence stretched between them, then Charlotte exhaled. "You think marrying me will destroy him?" Damon froze, she knew. "I'm not stupid, Damon." Her voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. "I just don't understand why you think I'm a pawn in your war." Damon didn't speak. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure how to respond. Damon had expected anger. He had expected Charlotte to storm out, to slap him, to call him a monster. But she didn't. She simply sat there, watching him with those sharp green eyes, as if measuring his soul. And for the first time in years, he felt exposed. She reached for her wine glass, taking a slow sip before setting it down. Her fingers traced the rim, thoughtful. So what happens now? Damon didn't answer immediately. He had spent years imagining this moment, laying his cards on the table, revealing his intentions with the cold precision of a man who had nothing to lose. And yet, now that the truth was between them, the victory tasted bitter. I don't know, he admitted. A flicker of amusement passed across her face. A billionaire without a plan. That's a first, Damon exhaled, running a hand through his hair. You should hate me. Maybe I should, she agreed, but I don't, he frowned. Why not? Charlotte leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Because I understand revenge. I've lived in my father's shadow my entire life. I know what it's like to want something so badly it consumes you. Damon studied her, intrigued. And what is it you want? She hesitated, then shrugged. Freedom. It was a simple word, but it carried weight. He suddenly saw her in a different light, not as his enemy's daughter, but as a woman trapped in a gilded cage, just like he had been once. A waiter approached with the check, but Damon barely registered him. His thoughts were tangled, his emotions foreign and unwelcome. He had never anticipated this pull towards her, this dangerous sense of understanding. Charlotte smirked. You look like a man who just realized he's in over his head. He chuckled, shaking his head. You have no idea. As they stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around them. His driver was waiting, but Charlotte turned to face him before he could open the car door. So what now? She asked again. Damon met her gaze, knowing there was only one answer. We get engaged. She searched his face, then nodded. All right. No hesitation, no bargaining, just acceptance. Damon should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt something dangerously close to regret. The engagement announcement spread through high society like wildfire. Business blogs analyzed the strategic implications. Tabloids speculated on the whirlwind romance, and Charlotte's father predictably reacted with unfiltered fury. Damon had expected resistance, but the sheer magnitude of William Hawthorne's outrage was almost impressive. He tried to block the engagement, called Charlotte to demand an explanation, even attempted to buy Damon off. None of it worked. Charlotte played her role masterfully, smiling for the cameras, slipping her hand into Damon's in public, whispering words that sounded like love to those who didn't know better. But in private, something shifted. She wasn't just pretending anymore, neither was he. One evening, they attended a charity gala, a glittering event filled with champagne, string quartets, and the city's most powerful figures. Damon had expected it to be another calculated display, another opportunity to flaunt their engagement in front of her father's associates. But then, Charlotte pulled him onto the dance floor. He wasn't a man who danced, but she didn't give him a choice. Her fingers laced through his, her body pressing close as the music swelled around them. You're tense, she murmured. I don't dance, he replied. She smiled. You do now. Damon exhaled, forcing himself to relax as they moved in perfect sync. The world blurred around them, the music fading until all he could hear was the sound of her breath. And in that moment, he forgot. He forgot why he had started this. He forgot the years of resentment, the weight of his father's downfall. All he saw was her. Charlotte tilted her head, studying him. You're looking at me differently. Damon swallowed. How am I supposed to look at my fiancé? Her lips curved. Like you actually want me, he exhaled sharply. And if I do, silence stretched between them. Then she whispered, then we're both in trouble. Damon didn't kiss her that night, but he wanted to, and that was the problem. Damon had spent years mastering control over his emotions, over his empire, over every carefully calculated move. But with Charlotte, control was slipping through his fingers like sand. He hadn't meant to want her, hadn't meant to crave the sound of her laughter or the way she looked at him when she thought no one was watching. But he did, and it was a problem. The engagement had started as a game, a way to destroy her father, to make him watch as the daughter he prized above all else slipped through his grasp and into the arms of the man he hated. But now, Damon found himself staring at Charlotte when she wasn't looking, memorizing the way she absent-mindedly tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her lips parted just slightly when she was lost in thought. And worst of all, he found himself wanting to protect her. That realization hit him full force one evening when he arrived at her penthouse and found her pacing, her phone clenched tightly in her hand. The moment she saw him, her expression hardened, but not before he caught the flicker of distress in her eyes. He shut the door behind him, watching her carefully. "What happened?" she exhaled sharply, setting her phone down on the marble counter. "My father," Damon's jaw clenched. He had expected William Hawthorne to retaliate, but he hadn't expected him to come after Charlotte directly. "What did he do?" She hesitated, then finally met his gaze. "He froze my accounts. Every single one. He's trying to force my hand." Damon's stomach tightened. He should have anticipated this. William wasn't the type to lose gracefully. But the idea of Charlotte being left vulnerable, of her father treating her like a pawn to be controlled, made something dark coil inside him. She crossed her arms, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Guess I'm officially cut off." Damon didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, made a single call, and within minutes, the issue was resolved. Charlotte watched him, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. "Yes, I did." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. She studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, her posture softened. "You really hate him, don't you?" Damon exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I hate what he did. What he took from my family." Charlotte nodded, but there was something in her gaze that Damon couldn't quite decipher. "And what about me?" she asked softly. "Am I just collateral damage?" Something in his chest tightened. He had told himself over and over that she was just a means to an end. But standing there, watching the vulnerability she rarely showed, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. "No," he said, "you're not." She held his gaze for a long moment, then stepped closer. "Then what am I?" Damon swallowed hard. If he was smart, he would walk away. He would remind himself of the plan, of the revenge that had driven him for so long. But he wasn't feeling particularly smart. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're the one thing I never saw coming." Charlotte inhaled sharply, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she reached for him, her fingers curling around the front of his shirt. And Damon was lost. He kissed her before he could stop himself. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't part of the plan. It was raw, desperate, and completely inevitable. Charlotte responded instantly, pressing herself against him as if she had been waiting for this just as much as he had. Damon's hands slid around her waist, pulling her closer, deepening the kiss until there was nothing left between them but heat and need. When they finally broke apart, Charlotte's breathing was uneven, her eyes searching his. "Tell me this isn't just part of your revenge." Damon tightened his grip on her waist. "It's not." For the first time in his life, he wasn't lying, but the war between their families wasn't over. And Damon knew that before this was done, there would be a price to pay. Damon had built his life on control, but Charlotte was the one thing he hadn't accounted for. And now, with the taste of her still lingering on his lips, the game he had set into motion no longer felt like one he could win. The days following their kiss were a blur of stolen moments and unspoken truths. They were still engaged for the world to see, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Charlotte wasn't just his fiancée in name anymore, she was the one thing he couldn't stop thinking about. But the world wasn't blind. They were the couple every headline obsessed over, the pairing that had sent shockwaves through high society. And more than that, William Hawthorne was watching. Damon had expected retaliation, but he hadn't anticipated just how far the man would go. Charlotte received the summons first, a formal invitation to dinner with her father. She didn't tell Damon immediately, but he noticed the way her expression darkened as she read the message. She had agreed to see him, but Damon wasn't foolish enough to let her go alone. When they arrived at the estate, the tension was suffocating. Charlotte walked ahead, her back straight, her chin lifted. Damon followed, his presence a silent promise that he wouldn't let William intimidate her. The man himself was waiting in his grand study, seated behind a mahogany desk that reeked of power. He didn't look at Charlotte first, his gaze locked onto Damon, a silent challenge burning in his eyes. Damon didn't flinch. Charlotte spoke before her father could. "I assume you didn't invite us here to give your blessing." William exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No, Charlotte. I invited you here because I want you to come to your senses." She tilted her head, unimpressed. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means," William leaned forward, his fingers steepled, "that this engagement is a mistake. And I'm giving you one last chance to end it." Damon had expected hostility, but the sheer arrogance in William's voice sent fire through his veins. He opened his mouth to speak, but Charlotte beat him to it. "If you think you can control me," she said coldly, "you don't know me at all." William's jaw clenched. "I didn't raise you to throw your future away on a man who only wants to destroy this family." Charlotte's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "Did you ever stop to think that maybe I love him?" The words landed like a gunshot. Damon's breath caught. William, however, didn't look impressed. He turned his gaze to Damon, studying him as if he were dissecting a weakness. "And you? Do you love her?" Damon had faced ruthless businessmen, hostile boardrooms, and high-stakes negotiations, but this was a different battlefield entirely. He could lie. He could say the words that would solidify his victory, or he could tell the truth. He reached for Charlotte's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "Yes," Charlotte inhaled sharply. William exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Then I suppose I have no daughter." The words should have shattered her. Instead, Charlotte squeezed Damon's hand and turned away from the man who had never truly seen her. Damon followed without hesitation. They left the estate behind, the weight of finality settling over them, but as they stepped into the night, Charlotte turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You meant it," she said softly. Damon didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." A slow smile spread across her lips, and in that moment he knew revenge no longer mattered. Charlotte did. Damon drove through the winding streets of the city, one hand gripping the wheel while the other rested over Charlotte's fingers. The weight of what had just happened at the Hawthorne estate pressed heavy between them, but neither spoke. There was no need. She had walked away from everything: the fortune, the name, the life she had always known. And she had done it without hesitation. Damon had spent years dreaming of destroying William Hawthorne, of watching his empire crumble the way his own father's had. And yet, now that the moment had come, the victory felt hollow. Because Charlotte had been the one to pay the price. As they pulled up to his penthouse, he shut off the engine but didn't move. Charlotte turned to him, her expression unreadable. The city lights reflected in her green eyes, casting a soft glow over her face. "You don't have to worry about me," she said, her voice even. Damon exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "You just walked away from everything. And," his grip on the wheel tightened, "and I don't want you to regret it." Charlotte held his gaze, unwavering. "Do you regret choosing me?" The question landed hard, but the answer came easily. "Never." A small smile ghosted her lips. "Then stop looking at me like I'm fragile." Damon sighed, shaking his head as he finally stepped out of the car. She followed him into the building, and as they rode the elevator up to his penthouse, a realization settled over him. Charlotte wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. She had made this choice with clear eyes, and she wasn't looking back, and neither was he. The next few days passed in a blur of change. Charlotte moved into Damon's penthouse, filling the space with an energy that hadn't been there before. She didn't hesitate to make herself at home, curling up with a book in his study, raiding his kitchen for midnight snacks, leaving traces of herself in ways he hadn't expected. And Damon found himself drawn to her in ways that had nothing to do with strategy or revenge. One evening, he walked in to find her standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, wrapped in one of his dress shirts, her hair a mess from where she had absent-mindedly been running her fingers through it. She didn't notice him at first, lost in thought as she gazed out over the city, but when she finally turned, something shifted in her expression. "You're staring," she murmured. Damon didn't deny it. She took a slow step toward him, then another, until she was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body. "I don't regret leaving," she whispered. "But I need to know if you regret not destroying him." Damon reached out, brushing his knuckles along her jaw. "I thought revenge was the most important thing in my life," he admitted. "But then I met you." Charlotte searched his face as if weighing the truth of his words. Then she exhaled softly. "So what happens now?" Damon smiled, slow and certain. "Now I prove to you that choosing me wasn't a mistake." She arched a brow. "And how do you plan to do that?" He leaned in, his lips a breath away from hers. "By making sure you never have a reason to doubt it." And then he kissed her. The engagement, once a weapon against William Hawthorne, became something real. The wedding plans moved forward, no longer a part of any scheme but a future they were both choosing. But Damon hadn't expected William to stay silent. The older man's influence stretched far, and it wasn't long before he made his next move. One afternoon, Damon's assistant stepped into his office, her expression tight. "Sir, there's something you need to see." She placed a tablet in front of him, and as Damon glanced at the screen, a cold fury settled in his chest. A headline blared across the page, accompanied by a carefully chosen photo of Charlotte and himself. "Lancaster Empire Under Fire, Hawthorne Scandal Unfolds." The article was ruthless. William had fed the media a carefully crafted story, spinning Charlotte's departure as a reckless betrayal, painting Damon as a manipulative opportunist who had seduced her as part of a long-standing vendetta. Damon's phone buzzed with calls from investors, board members, and PR teams, all demanding damage control. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was Charlotte. He found her in the penthouse, curled up on the couch with a mug of tea, her phone abandoned beside her. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "You saw it," she said simply. Damon nodded. "He's trying to turn the world against you." Charlotte let out a slow breath, setting her mug down. "He's just trying to scare me into coming back." Damon sat beside her, his fingers brushing against hers. "And is it working?" She turned to him, her gaze steady. "No." His shoulders relaxed, but the anger simmered beneath his skin. "I can fix this, I'll shut it down." Charlotte shook her head. "You don't have to, let him throw his tantrum. People will talk, but they'll move on." Damon studied her, searching for any trace of doubt, but she was calm, resolute. "He's losing," she murmured. "That's why he's lashing out." Damon exhaled, his grip tightening around her hand. "You're incredible, you know that," Charlotte smirked. "Took you long enough to figure it out." The wedding took place a month later, despite the headlines, despite the whispers. It was a private ceremony held in a villa overlooking the ocean, far from the city and its chaos. Only those who truly mattered were there, and for the first time in years, Damon felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. As Charlotte walked down the aisle, dressed in ivory silk, her eyes locked onto his, he knew this was the only victory that had ever mattered. The moment she reached him, he took her hands in his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with nerves. Charlotte smirked up at him. "No turning back now, Lancaster." Damon chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a chance." And as they exchanged vows, as he slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her like he never wanted to stop, Damon realized something. Revenge had brought them together. But love had made them whole. The reception was in full swing, the warm night air carrying the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses over the villa's terrace. Damon stood near the edge, his gaze fixed on Charlotte as she moved effortlessly through the crowd, speaking with the few guests they had invited. The golden glow of lanterns overhead cast a soft light on her, making her look almost ethereal. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of change, but standing here now, watching his wife Damon felt something settle in his chest. A quiet certainty, a peace that had eluded him for years. Charlotte turned as if sensing his gaze, and her lips curved into a knowing smile. Without hesitation, she made her way to him, slipping her arms around his waist as she leaned into him. His hand found the small of her back, pulling her even closer. "You look like you're having fun." She tilted her head back, watching him with those sharp green eyes that had ensnared him from the start. "I am," Damon exhaled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Good." For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about his past, his father's downfall, or even William Hawthorne's desperate attempts to control what he had already lost. All that mattered was her here in his arms. Charlotte's fingers trailed along the lapel of his suit, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You're happy." Damon didn't hesitate. "I am." Her expression softened, and for a moment, the world around them faded into a blur of distant music and soft candlelight. Then, without warning, she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the dance floor. Damon raised an eyebrow. "I thought we agreed dancing wasn't my thing." Charlotte grinned, her eyes glinting with mischief. "You married me, Lancaster. That means you don't get a choice anymore." A chuckle rumbled in his chest, but he let her lead him onto the dance floor. The music slowed, and as he pulled her against him, swaying to the rhythm, he realized that he didn't care who was watching. Charlotte rested her head against his chest, her fingers laced with his. "I think this is the first time in my life that I feel completely free." Damon tightened his grip around her waist. He knew what she meant. They had both been trapped in something before expectations, revenge, legacies they had never asked for. But now none of that mattered. "You are," he murmured against her hair. "We both are." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she pulled him down into a slow, lingering kiss, one that spoke of promises already made, of futures yet to come. When they finally broke apart, Charlotte's smile was soft, her fingers tracing the edge of his jaw. "I think I love you, Damon Lancaster." His heart stopped, then restarted with a force that nearly stole his breath. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "I love you, Charlotte." The words came easily, naturally, because they were true. She exhaled, a sound that was almost a laugh, and rested her forehead against his. "Good, because you're stuck with me now." Damon smiled, a rare, genuine thing. "Forever." And as the music played on, as the night stretched out before them, Damon knew that, for the first time in his life, he had exactly what he had always needed. Not revenge, not power. Just her.